In this lecture, we're going to review some of the basic characteristics and features of hormones secreted by the endocrine system. And the first basic characteristic here relates to stability. And the stability of a hormone is quantified as what's called the half-life. And the half-life refers to how long it takes for half of the concentration to be eliminated and hence metabolized from the circulatory system. So there are two general types of hormones. Hormones are either lipid-soluble or water-soluble. Lipid-soluble hormones typically have longer half-lives and last longer in the circulation than water-soluble hormones. And so water-soluble hormones typically have a more rapid distribution through the body and a more rapid effect once those water-soluble hormones find a location to bind to the specific protein receptors in the membranes of the target tissues. In terms of communication, the interaction between a hormone and a target cell must involve the recognition of that cell for that particular hormone, and it is carried out by the specific affinity or recognition through the proteins embedded in the membranes of those cells. And so in order for the hormone to have an effect on that cell, the hormone must be recognized by protein receptors embedded in the membrane or protein receptors that are located inside the cell in the cytoplasm. The distribution of hormones occurs through the cardiovascular system. So hormones can dissolve directly in blood plasma, and those are the water-soluble hormones. And so those are hormones that have a chemical structure and a chemical nature that allows the reversible binding with H2O molecules, which is the major constituent molecule of blood plasma. Hormones that are classified as lipid-soluble must be transported by binding to proteins in the cardiovascular system in the blood. In other words, plasma proteins. And so some of the lipid-soluble hormones are the steroid hormones. And so the steroid hormones are derivations of cholesterol, and as such have a very low ability to form reversible chemical bonds with H2O, and so must therefore be bound to plasma proteins. And the overall feature of hormones is that these are compounds, whether they're water-soluble or lipid-soluble, distributes very quickly through the body because of the transport mechanism of the blood and the cardiovascular system. On this slide, we're going to contrast using this drawing of how the two general types of hormones distribute through the cardiovascular system. And we start with water-soluble hormones. And so what we see here is an endocrine cell. And this is a cell that, when detects a signal or some stimulus, will produce a water-soluble hormone. And one example is the beta cell of the pancreas. And so the response here is that the beta cell will produce a protein called insulin. And as such, being a protein, it is able to move out of the beta cell and into the cardiovascular system and form reversible chemical bonds with H2O. And so it is water soluble and allows it to move quite freely through the body, where it finds a location here on a target cell, and it must be recognized by a protein receptor embedded in the membrane of this cell. This cell, specific to insulin, would be a skeletal muscle cell or a liver cell. And the response here is that it will trigger the muscle cell to remove glucose from the cardiovascular system and move it into the muscle cell. The other type of hormone here we see on the bottom is the lipid soluble hormone, and in this situation here we see an endocrine cell that will produce a lipid soluble hormone. So two types of organs that will produce these types of hormones are the testes and the ovaries, and both of these organs contain cells that will produce testosterone. And testosterone is a lipid-soluble hormone, so that when it does get produced and secreted into the cardiovascular system, it will very quickly bind to a protein, a plasma protein that naturally exists in plasma that will function as the transporter for testosterone through the body. Once testosterone reaches a target tissue, it will detach from the protein carrier and be able to migrate quite easily through the membranes of the cells of the cardiovascular system and the membranes of the muscle cell. And one of the effects here is that testosterone will migrate into the nucleus of the cell, in this example a muscle cell, and trigger an increase in protein synthesis as well. In other words, it will trigger the muscle cell to increase the rate at which the muscle cell is making new proteins for that muscle cell. In terms of the chemical nature of hormones, we see that we have different examples of lipid-soluble hormones. And what we have here are the so-called steroid hormones, and the steroid hormones are all derivatives of cholesterol. And two examples are testosterone and aldosterone, and we see that the chemical structures don't seem to be very different from these two hormones. Amino acid derivatives can also, or amino acids can be used to make lipid-soluble hormones as well. One such example is thyroid hormone. And fatty acid derivatives are also used to make what are called prostaglandins. And in this case, what we're seeing here is an omega type of fatty acid that can be used to make the prostaglandins. And coming back to our cholesterol-based hormones that we just generally refer to as steroids, we ask this question, is cholesterol good or bad? Cholesterol is considered both good and bad. Cholesterol is a molecule that is necessary to provide stability to cell membranes, and cholesterol is a very important molecule because it allows the human organism to make vitamin D as well as to make hormones. Cholesterol is also viewed as potentially unhealthy or bad because too much dietary cholesterol, or a person that is unable to physiologically manage cholesterol may be at risk for developing cardiovascular disease. Just as a couple of examples here with water-soluble hormones, we see that water-soluble hormones exist as either proteins or peptides. Peptides are amino acid connections, but much, much smaller than proteins. Water-soluble hormones do have a short half-life. Because these hormones can dissolve quite easily in plasma, they tend to be able to transport much faster and can move into target tissues much faster as well. Two examples of water-soluble hormones that are structurally proteins is TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. This is a hormone secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and its function is to stimulate the thyroid gland, and when stimulating the cells of the thyroid gland will produce another round of hormones that will affect whole body metabolism. We also see a protein called growth hormone also secreted from the anterior pituitary gland. This lower image that you see here, these two lower images, here we see thyrotropin releasing hormone that we'll discuss a little bit later. And this is the chemical structure, the amino acid sequence for insulin. And although insulin is a protein, structurally it functions as a hormone. So this ends this part 2 lecture of our endocrine system.